The morning her divorce was finalized, Margaret Cole stood on the courthouse steps in downtown Chicago and did something no one expected. She smiled. Not the broken smile of a woman who had just lost everything. Not the polite smile of someone trying to hold herself together in public. A quiet, deliberate smile. The kind that belongs to someone who already knows how the story ends. Her husband Daniel stood 20 feet away, laughing with his attorneys already on his phone, already moving on. He had the house. He had the portfolio. He had the business empire she had spent 12 years quietly building alongside him, while her own career dissolved into nothing. He had given her $65,000 and a signature on a piece of paper. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that 3 days earlier, Margaret had found something in an abandoned subway tunnel beneath the streets of Chicago. Something that had been waiting 50 years for exactly the right person to find it. Daniel Cole thought he had buried her. He had actually handed her a shovel, and over the next 6 months, Margaret would use it to dig up every secret he had spent a lifetime hiding, secrets that would bring down not just her ex-husband, but a United States senator, a corrupt legal network, and a financial crime that stretched back half a century. She didn't get angry. She got ready. The courtroom smelled like old wood and cold air conditioning. The kind of institutional chill that seeps into your bones and reminds you that the building doesn't care about you. It never did. Margaret Cole sat perfectly straight in her chair, hands folded on the table in front of her, eyes forward. She had been sitting in this position for most of the morning, and she had not shifted once. Around her, the room moved with the quiet, bureaucratic rhythm of legal proceedings. Papers shuffled, chairs scraped. A clerk typed something into a computer without looking up. The judge, a heavy-set man named Beaumont, with reading glasses pushed low on his nose, reviewed the final documents with the unhurried pace of someone who had dissolved hundreds of marriages in this room and expected to dissolve hundreds more. Margaret watched him without expression. She had learned in the past 14 months of proceedings to control her face completely. Every micro-expression, every flicker of emotion had been studied and used against her in this room. Daniel's attorneys were extraordinarily good at their work. They had spent months constructing a portrait of Margaret Cole as a woman of limited contribution, minimal relevance, and convenient memory. They had done it with the precision of architects, and they had done it while Margaret sat 3 feet away, watching. She had watched all of it. She had remembered all of it. Daniel sat at the opposing table with his 3 attorneys arranged around him like a well-dressed wall. He was 58 years old, broad-shouldered, with silver hair. He kept precisely cut, and a face that had aged in the way that powerful men's faces sometimes do not softened by time, but hardened, sharpened, as if the years had simply stripped away everything that wasn't essential to his ambitions. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. His cufflinks caught the fluorescent light. He had not looked at Margaret once this morning. That was deliberate. She understood that. It was a dominance display, practiced and effective. The message was simple. You are already irrelevant. I have already moved on. You are a problem I have solved. Judge Beaumont cleared his throat. In the matter of Cole versus Cole, the court accepts the settlement agreement as presented. The marriage is hereby dissolved. Mrs. Cole will receive the agreed sum of $65,000 payable within 30 days. Mr. Cole retains all properties, investment accounts, and business assets as detailed in the agreement. He looked over his glasses at both tables. Does either party have anything to add? Daniel's lead attorney shook his head smoothly. No, Your Honor. Everyone looked at Margaret. She held the pause for exactly 2 seconds longer than was comfortable. No, she said quietly. Not today. The gavel came down. The room began its quiet motion of dispersal. Daniel stood immediately, buttoning his jacket, already leaning toward his attorney, with something that looked like a question about dinner reservations. Margaret stood, slowly gathered the single folder she had brought, and walked out of the courtroom alone. She took the stairs instead of the elevator. On the courthouse steps, Chicago spread out before her in the pale October light. The city was doing what it always did, moving indifferent, enormous. Traffic sounds rose from the streets below. Wind cut between the buildings. Margaret stood at the top of the steps and breathed. Behind her, the courthouse doors opened. Daniel emerged with his attorneys, and a moment later, his phone was at his ear. He was laughing at something. The laugh carried easily in the cold air. Margaret turned and looked at him. He noticed finally, and the laugh faded by a fraction. Just a fraction. His eyes met hers across the steps, and for a moment something passed between them that had nothing to do with the legal proceedings just concluded. Something older than the divorce. Something that had been building for 12 years. Margaret allowed herself one small, precise smile. Then she said clearly enough for him to hear, "Enjoy it while it lasts." She turned and walked down the steps before he could respond. She didn't look back. There was no point. She already knew the expression on his face, the brief flash of uncertainty, quickly buried under arrogance. She had studied that face for 12 years. She knew every configuration it was capable of. What she did not know yet, walking away from the courthouse on that cold October morning, was that 4 blocks east and 30 feet underground, something had been waiting for her for 50 years. A vault in an abandoned subway station, sealed and forgotten since 1972. A dead woman's last act of defiance. The weapon she didn't know she was about to find. But that discovery was still 3 weeks away. First, Margaret Cole had to survive the immediate arithmetic of her situation, and it was brutal. $65,000. No job, no recent employment history. A city where a decent 1-bedroom apartment cost $3,000 a month. At 52 years old, she had done the math many times. She had done it the way she used to do everything before her marriage had gradually, quietly, completely consumed her professional identity. Margaret had been a certified public accountant before Daniel. A good one, the kind of accountant who saw patterns in financial data the way other people heard music intuitively, immediately, with a kind of pleasure that was difficult to explain to people who didn't share it. She had given up her practice in the 3rd year of their marriage when Daniel's real estate development company had begun its serious expansion, and he had needed her full attention on his finances, his schedule, his social obligations, his everything. It had seemed at the time like a practical decision made between partners. In retrospect, it had been the first step in a carefully managed process of isolation. Strip away the career, then the professional network, then the independent income, then the friends who weren't part of Daniel's world, then the confidence that came from knowing you could function without someone. By the time Margaret understood what had happened, she was 44 years old and completely embedded in a life that belonged in every practical sense to her husband. She walked for a long time after the courthouse. No destination, just movement, because movement was better than stillness, and the apartment she was currently renting with part of her settlement advance, a cramped 2-room sublet in Lincoln Park, felt like a space she couldn't quite breathe in. She had Shadow with her in a carrier. The black cat had been her companion for 6 years, a stray she'd found during a winter that had been particularly difficult in ways she hadn't fully admitted at the time. Shadow was the only living creature in Margaret's current life that looked at her without calculation. The two of them moved through the city together, Margaret on foot, Shadow occasionally shifting in the carrier, occasionally observing the passing world through the mesh with the serene detachment that cats maintain in nearly all circumstances. Margaret was navigating by instinct more than intention. She found herself by early afternoon in the old financial district, the blocks around LaSalle and Adams that still carried the architectural memory of Chicago's early 20th century ambitions. Buildings from the 1920s stood alongside glass towers, their limestone facades detailed with the kind of ornate craftsmanship that modern construction had made economically impossible. Gargoyles, carved keystones, decorative ironwork on gates that no longer served any purpose except beauty. She stopped in front of one in particular, the Harrington Trust Building. 19 stories of dark limestone, built in 1928, with a facade that featured carved figures representing commerce industry and justice at the main entrance. The bank that had originally occupied the building had failed in 1973. The building had passed through several owners since then, and now housed a mix of law firms, financial consultants, and a restaurant on the ground floor that was only open for lunch. Margaret had walked past this building many times over the years. She had never paid particular attention to it before. But today, standing on the sidewalk with $65,000 to her name and no clear path forward, she stood and looked at it for a long time. Something about the building held her attention, something she couldn't immediately articulate. She sat down on a bench across the street and opened Shadow's carrier to let the cat get some air. Shadow stepped out onto the bench with the deliberate dignity of a creature who considers all surfaces equally her own and sat beside Margaret, surveying the street. "We're in a difficult position," Margaret said quietly. Shadow did not appear alarmed by this assessment. Margaret looked at the building, at the street, at the ordinary mid-afternoon life of downtown Chicago flowing around her. Office workers moving between buildings, a food truck 2 blocks down with a short line, pigeons, yellow cabs, the distant sound of a jackhammer somewhere to the north. And then she noticed something she had walked past 100 times without seeing. Near the base of the Harrington Trust building, half obscured by a planter that had been placed against the building's foundation wall, was a metal grating set into the sidewalk. Old. Very old. The iron was reddish with rust at the edges, and the mechanism that should have secured it, a heavy-duty padlock, had corroded to the point where it was barely recognizable as a lock anymore. There was a sign on the grating. The metal plate was so weathered that Margaret had to cross the street and crouch down to read it. Chicago Transit Authority Service, Access, Harrington Station, Maintenance Personnel, only authorized access, required beyond this point, 1931. Margaret straightened and looked around. The street was moderately busy, but nobody was paying attention to a woman crouching by a building foundation. She looked at the grating more carefully. The hinges were old but intact. The corroded padlock, when she pressed it, crumbled at the shackle with almost no resistance. 50 years of Chicago winters had done the work for her. She thought about this for a moment. She thought about the hotel she had been considering, $189 a night, which would consume nearly $4,000 a month. She thought about the sublet in Lincoln Park and its paper-thin walls, and the landlord who had already made 2 passive-aggressive comments about the cat. She thought about $65,000, dividing itself by $3,800 a month until it disappeared. And then Margaret Cole, former CPA, made a decision that was simultaneously the most irrational and the most strategically sound choice she had made in 12 years. She reached down, broke the corroded padlock with a firm twist, and lifted the grating. Cool air rose from below. The smell of earth and old metal and something else, a faint dry smell like paper stored in the dark for decades. Margaret retrieved the small LED flashlight she had begun carrying 2 weeks earlier, when the Lincoln Park sublet's hallway light stopped working and the landlord proved unresponsive. She clicked it on. Concrete steps descended into darkness. The walls were tiled white subway tile she could see with a dark border pattern. The staircase was narrow but intact. She looked at Shadow. Shadow looked at the opening with the particular focused attention cats give to dark spaces. 12 years of bad decisions, Margaret said. One more can't hurt. She transferred Shadow back into the carrier, picked up both the carrier and her bag, and descended into the dark. She counted the steps. 36. The staircase curved slightly at the bottom, and then the corridor opened into something that made Margaret stop moving and simply stand her flashlight beam sweeping slowly across the space. Harrington Station. It was intact. That was the first and most astonishing thing. After 60 years of abandonment, 60 years of Chicago winters above, and the rumble of active transit lines nearby Harrington Station was standing. The platform stretched approximately 200 feet in each direction. The ceiling arched overhead at perhaps 20 feet, covered in the same white subway tile as the staircase, with a geometric border in deep green and warm gold that ran at eye level along the walls. Brass light fixtures hung from the ceiling on decorative brackets, their bulbs long dead, but the fixtures themselves still elegant, still structurally sound, tarnished to a dark bronze that the flashlight turned almost amber. Along the platform walls, in the spaces between the support columns, advertising boards from the 1940s still hung in their frames. Wartime bond campaigns, department stores that no longer existed, a cigarette advertisement featuring a clean-cut man in a hat. The colors had faded to pastels, but the images were still recognizable. The floor of the platform was thick with dust. But beneath the dust, Margaret could see the original tile, the same green and gold geometric pattern. The floor was dry, no standing water, no major cracks in the platform's surface. She walked the length of the platform slowly, the flashlight moving across surfaces cataloging. A former accountant's mind doesn't stop assessing just because the context has changed. She was taking inventory. At the far end of the platform, a door marked Station Manager. Beyond the platform in the wall to her right, a corridor marked Utilities Authorized Personnel. And at the tunnel mouth, the dark throat of the tracks she could hear faintly transmitted through the earth, the rumble of the modern transit system running somewhere nearby. The city was still moving above and around this space. Harrington Station was simply no longer part of it. She tried the station manager's door. It opened. The room inside was small, perhaps 12 feet by 10, with a single desk, a wooden chair, and a row of empty hooks on the wall where keys had once hung. A filing cabinet in the corner. Dust on everything. But the room was dry. The walls were solid. The ceiling showed no water damage. There was a door on the interior wall that she discovered led to a bathroom non-functional, obviously, but structurally intact. Margaret set Shadow's carrier down. Shadow stepped out, immediately sniffed. The desk walked the perimeter of the room twice with methodical attention, then sat in the center and looked at Margaret. "What do you think?" Margaret asked. Shadow blinked once, which Margaret chose to interpret as approval. That first night, Margaret slept on her coat on the floor of the station manager's office. Shadow curled against her side, and she slept better than she had in months. The darkness underground was absolute. The silence was profound. And in that silence away from the apartment, with its thin walls, and the city with its constant noise, and the courthouse with its cold fluorescent lights, Margaret Cole felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. She felt like herself. In the morning, she assessed her situation with the clear-eyed practicality that had always been her natural mode when no one was interfering with it. The station had significant potential as temporary shelter. It was dry, structurally sound, large, private, and crucially invisible. No one knew she was here. She was, for the first time in over a year of the most scrutinized period of her life, completely off the grid. Her immediate needs, water, sanitation, light, food, communication, all solvable. Within the first week, Margaret established her systems with the methodical efficiency of someone used to building frameworks from scratch. She located a 24-hour diner 4 blocks north Archie's, a 50-year-old institution with a counter and booths and a staff that was accustomed to regulars who didn't ask for much. She began going there each morning for coffee and use of the facilities. She left a generous tip each time. No one asked questions. The Chicago Public Library's Harold Washington location was 6 blocks west. She had a library card. The library had bathrooms, electrical outlets, computers, and research databases. She began spending her days there, arriving when it opened and leaving an hour before closing. She bought supplies with careful deliberation. Battery-powered LED lanterns, 4 of them. A set of high-capacity rechargeable batteries and a quality charger. A portable camping stove that ran on small canisters. A water filtration system designed for backcountry camping. A folding camp cot ordered online and delivered to the Lincoln Park sublet she still technically rented for another 3 weeks. A good sleeping bag. Heavy-duty cleaning supplies. She moved everything to the station over 3 nights, traveling light each time, always in the hours after midnight, when the streets around the financial district were quiet. The water system she devised herself. The station's utility corridor contained old steam pipes, long disconnected from any active system, but still present along the ceiling. In the temperature differential between the cool underground air and the warmer pipes, which retained some thermal mass from the surrounding earth, condensation formed reliably. She positioned clean collection containers beneath the most productive drip points. Overnight, she consistently collected between 1 and 2 gallons. Filtered through the camping unit, it was clean enough to drink and cook with. For supplemental water, she bought bottles at the grocery store 2 blocks from the diner and carried them down in small quantities. The lighting system evolved quickly from the initial battery lanterns. The library's outlets combined with a rotation of 8 high-capacity power banks that Margaret brought in pairs each day and charged while she worked, provided enough stored energy to run LED strip lighting she installed along the ceiling of the station manager's office and portions of the platform. The LEDs were extraordinarily efficient. A fully charged power bank could sustain her lighting needs for 4 days. She began cleaning. The work was meditative in a way she hadn't expected. Each section of tile required the same process: initial dry brushing to remove surface dust, then careful work with a cleaning solution. She mixed herself from supplies bought at a janitorial wholesaler, then a final wipe with clean water. What emerged from beneath the accumulated grime of 60 years was extraordinary. The mosaic border along the platform walls revealed itself gradually as she worked from west to east, section by section, over the course of 2 weeks. Deep emerald green and warm antique gold, arranged in an Art Deco geometric pattern that was both complex and perfectly balanced. The original designers, she eventually identified them through library research as a firm called Whitfield and Crane, active in Chicago from 1919 to 1941, had created something intended to elevate the daily experience of commuters. They had succeeded. The restored sections of Harrington Station were genuinely beautiful, with the specific beauty of craftsmanship that has been done well for its own sake. She found furniture. Chicago's streets, she discovered, were extraordinarily generous to someone who paid attention. Wealthy neighborhoods discarded items of real quality pieces replaced by renovation rather than by failure. In a single week of early morning walks through Lincoln Park, Gold Coast, and Streeterville before garbage collection, Margaret found a leather reading chair that needed only cleaning, a solid oak side table, 2 floor lamps in need of new wiring, but otherwise excellent, and 3 boxes of books left outside a closing legal office on Michigan Avenue. She carried everything down in pieces over successive nights. 6 weeks after descending into Harrington Station, Margaret Cole sat in a leather reading chair on a restored Art Deco platform, illuminated by warm LED light, drinking filtered water, reading a copy of John Cheever. Short stories she had found in one of the abandoned law office boxes while Shadow occupied the oak side table with proprietary satisfaction. Her monthly expenses had dropped to $420. Food, toiletries, power bank replacement batteries, and the occasional coffee at Archie's. The $65,000, instead of lasting 18 months, could sustain her for 12 years at this burn rate. She was not planning to need 12 years. She was planning to need enough time to do what she actually came underground to do, which brought her to the second week and to the decision she had made in the courtroom, the one she had not shared with anyone. 3 days after the divorce was finalized, Margaret had been in the Lincoln Park sublet, going through the folder she had assembled over 14 months of proceedings. She had kept copies of everything, every document, every filing, every piece of correspondence. It had been a habit from her CPA years that she had never been able to abandon even during the marriage, when Daniel had discouraged what he called her excessive record-keeping. In the folder was a bank statement she had received by mistake, a misfiled document that had been included in a discovery production by Daniel's team, a clerical error, and one that Margaret suspected Daniel's lead attorney had been furious about when he noticed it. The statement was from a private account in Daniel's name at a bank she didn't recognize. The relevant entry was a wire transfer of $40,000 to an account she could not immediately identify. It had taken her 3 days of library research to trace the receiving account through publicly available corporate filings. It belonged to her former attorney, the man who had represented her in the divorce, the man who had advised her to accept the $65,000 settlement as the best she could realistically expect. Margaret had sat with this knowledge for a full day before she did anything. She sat with it the way she had learned to sit with difficult financial findings in her CPA years, not reacting, not moving, just absorbing the full shape of the information and what it implied. What it implied was that Daniel had not merely outmaneuvered her in court. He had corrupted the process at its foundation. Her own attorney had been his instrument. The settlement was not the result of legitimate legal proceedings. It was the result of a purchased outcome. This changed things considerably. Margaret photographed the bank statement from multiple angles, stored copies in 3 separate encrypted cloud accounts, wrote out a detailed account of her analysis with timestamps and references, and began researching attorneys. Not divorce attorneys, financial fraud attorneys. She was looking for someone specific, a litigator with a background in forensic accounting, with experience in cases involving corruption of legal proceedings, with a reputation for taking cases that seemed lost on their face. She found Aldous Beckett through a law review article published 18 months earlier about a case involving fraudulent expert testimony in a commercial dispute in Cook County. His analysis in the article was precise and showed an understanding of financial forensics that Margaret recognized as genuine. She sent him a carefully worded email from a new account she'd created for the purpose describing her situation in general terms, and asking whether he would be available to discuss a matter involving potential fraud in a divorce proceeding. He responded within 4 hours. Yes, he would be available. She had not yet met with him in person. That was coming. But she needed something first. She needed to understand the full scope of what Daniel had done, not just the attorney bribe, but the larger financial architecture she had glimpsed during 12 years of marriage and never been allowed to examine directly. She knew things. She had always known things. The CPA in her had never fully turned off even when she had set aside her practice. She had noticed the patterns in Daniel's business over the years, the occasional explanations that didn't quite add up, the accounts she was told not to worry about, the meetings that happened without her and were never discussed afterward. She had filed these observations and said nothing, because the alternative had not yet become necessary. The alternative was now necessary. This was the second reason she had chosen to live underground. Not just financial practicality, strategic invisibility. Daniel's people, and she was already certain he had people watching her movements, because she had seen the same man in a gray coat in 3 different locations over 3 days, could not track what they could not find. Below ground, Margaret was unreachable. Below ground, she could think. It was on a Tuesday in the 3rd week during a routine cleaning session in the utility corridor that she found the station manager's inner office, a room she had assumed was simply storage behind a door that had been warped shut by decades of temperature changes and required a firm shoulder to open. Inside was exactly what she expected: old equipment, rusted and inert, a rack of ancient electrical panels, a decaying wooden cabinet, but pushed against the far wall, barely visible behind a collapsed shelf unit, was something else. A wooden desk, small, functional, old. And on the desk, beneath a coating of dust so thick it had become a kind of gray felt, a book, a journal. Margaret carried it carefully to the station manager's office, set it under her best light, and opened it. The handwriting was small and precise in blue ink that had faded to a gray blue over 50 years. The first page read, Eleanor Marsh Private, 1971. Margaret turned the pages slowly. Eleanor Marsh had been an accountant, senior accounts manager at Harrington Trust Bank, the institution that had occupied the building directly above the station until its failure in 1973. She had worked there since 1961. She had begun keeping this private journal in 1971 because she wrote in the opening pages she had started seeing things in the bank's accounts that she could not reconcile with legitimate operations. Numbers that didn't follow the logic she had spent a decade learning. Money that appeared and disappeared in ways that she could not explain through any normal business activity. Margaret read for 3 hours without stopping. Eleanor Marsh had been meticulous. She had understood what she was looking at, the movement of money through the bank's accounts in ways designed to obscure origin and ownership, funneling funds offshore and back, creating paper trails that looked legitimate to a casual examiner, but revealed themselves as constructed when you understood the underlying patterns. She had documented everything in this journal with the precision of someone who knew she was building a case. She had also understood the danger. The entries became more urgent as 1971 became 1972. Names appeared, the bank's senior officers and others. External parties who were the beneficial recipients of the transactions Eleanor had documented. Businessmen, a local politician or two, and repeatedly with special notations indicating priority and sensitivity, a name that appeared again and again. Cole. Margaret's hands went very still on the page. Cole, not Daniel. Daniel would have been a child in the early 1970s, but Cole Sr., Bernard Cole, Daniel's father, who had died in 2004, and whose obituary Daniel kept framed in his office because it listed the founding of the Cole family real estate business as a landmark in Chicago commercial history. The real estate business that Daniel had inherited, that he had built upon, that now comprised 17 properties in the Chicago metropolitan area, 3 in other states, and a portfolio that his divorce attorneys had valued at approximately $34 million. The business that Eleanor Marsh's journal suggested had been built at its foundation on money laundered through Harrington Trust. Margaret sat in the quiet of the underground station, the journal open in her hands, and felt the shape of something enormous coming clear. She turned to the final pages. Eleanor's last entries were from late 1972. The handwriting had changed, still precise, but faster, more compressed, as if written under pressure. The final entry was dated November 14th, 1972. They know I've been looking. Harrison called me into his office today and asked me questions I wasn't meant to be able to answer, and I answered them too well. I need to move the records. I've already moved copies of the most important documents to the vault, the secondary vault, not the main floor. The one downstairs. Nobody from the bank goes down there anymore, not since the station closed. I have a key from when I used to use the employee entrance. I've put everything that matters into the vault and locked it. If someone finds this, they are either already safe or already in danger. I don't know which. But the vault is behind the east utility panel in the maintenance corridor. The combination is the founding year of the bank and the number of floors. Don't let them win. E.M. The journal ended there. Margaret closed it carefully. She sat for a long moment in complete silence. Then she stood, picked up her flashlight, and walked out of the station manager's office through the platform and into the utility corridor. She walked to the east end of the corridor, moving the flashlight beam slowly across the walls. The corridor was lined with old utility panels, electrical ventilation pipe access. All of them faced with metal covers secured by screws or bolts, all of them decades old, except one. Near the far end, half hidden behind a section of old ducting that had partially collapsed away from the ceiling, was a panel that was different from the others. Larger, set slightly deeper into the wall. The metal was the same age, the same rust pattern, the same institutional gray. But the seam around its edges was different. Not a standard utility panel, but something fitted into the wall with care. Something that had been designed to look like the others while serving a different purpose. Margaret stood in front of it for a long moment. The founding year of the bank, 1928. The number of floors, 19. The combination would be 19-28 or some arrangement thereof. She would work through the variations systematically. But that was tomorrow's work. Tonight, she stood in the utility corridor of an abandoned Chicago subway station, 52 years old, with $65,000 and a dissolved marriage and an attorney who had been paid to betray her. She stood with a dead woman's journal in her hand and the knowledge that somewhere behind a metal panel, sealed away for 50 years, was the weapon she had not known she was looking for. Daniel Cole had tried to bury her. He had buried her in exactly the right place. She looked at the panel. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned and walked back to the station manager's office where Shadow was waiting on the desk with the patient composure of a creature who had decided that wherever Margaret Cole chose to be was by definition home. Margaret sat down, opened her notebook, and began to write. Dates, names, numbers, the architecture of what she was beginning to understand. Outside, Chicago moved through its Tuesday night. Traffic and wind and the distant sound of the elevated train. Up on the street, 36 steps above Margaret's head, the Harrington Trust Building stood in the dark. Commerce, industry, justice. The carved figures over the entrance had been watching the street for 95 years. 50 years ago, a woman named Eleanor Marsh had tried to do the right thing in this building and had disappeared. Now, someone else was in the building's basement reading Eleanor's words by LED light, with a cat on the desk and a notebook full of numbers and the cold, specific patience of a person who has stopped being afraid and started being ready. Margaret wrote until 2 a.m. Then she turned off the light, lay down on her cot, and slept without dreaming. She did not open the vault immediately. That surprised her afterward when she thought about it. Most people she imagined would have gone straight for it. The combination fresh in their minds, the discovery still electric, the urgency of the moment compelling immediate action. But Margaret Cole had not survived 12 years of a sophisticated and patient predator by being impulsive. She had survived by watching, by waiting, by understanding that the quality of information you extract from a situation depends entirely on how prepared you are to receive it. She needed to be prepared, so she spent 4 days in the Harold Washington Library before she touched the panel again. She pulled everything the library's databases contained on Harrington Trust Bank. Corporate filings from the Illinois Secretary of State's archives. News coverage from the Chicago Tribune going back to 1931. Federal Reserve examination reports from the 1960s and early 1970s that had been declassified and digitized. The FDIC records from the bank's 1973 failure, which were publicly available and surprisingly detailed. Academic papers on the wave of mid-sized bank failures that had swept the Midwest between 1971 and 1975, and the financial mechanisms, legitimate and otherwise, that had contributed to them. She read everything. She took notes in the systematic shorthand she had developed during her CPA years, compressed, precise, cross-referenced, organized by date and entity and transaction type. By the end of the 4 days, she had 40 pages of notes and a clear structural understanding of what Harrington Trust had been, how it had operated, and when it had gone wrong. The bank had been founded in 1928, 1 year before the crash, by a consortium of Chicago businessmen with interests in commercial real estate and municipal contracts. It had survived the Depression barely through a combination of conservative lending practices and strategic relationships with city government that kept municipal deposits flowing through its accounts. Through the 1940s and 1950s, it had grown steadily, never a major institution, but stable, reliable, with a client base concentrated in Chicago's commercial real estate sector. The problems, as best as Margaret could reconstruct from the public record, had begun in the mid-1960s. The bank's leadership had changed, the founding generation retiring or dying, their replacements younger and more aggressive, less attached to the conservative principles that had kept the institution solvent through difficult decades. New clients had come in, new types of business. The bank's real estate lending had expanded rapidly, and with the expansion had come relationships that the public record described only in the careful language of regulatory concern. Concentrations of credit, affiliated transactions, inadequate documentation of loan purposes. The regulatory language was a polished surface over something uglier, and Eleanor Marsh's journal was the key to what lay beneath it. Margaret understood it now with the full context of her research behind her. Harrington Trust had become in the late 1960s a mechanism. Money of unclear origin. Margaret's research suggested connections to construction industry, kickback schemes, and municipal contract manipulation that had plagued Chicago's political ecosystem for decades, was moved through the bank's accounts in patterns that made it look like legitimate real estate lending and repayment. The money came in dirty. It came out clean, attached to real assets, real transactions, real documentation. And the people it came out clean for were the bank's best clients, its most valued relationships, the ones who received the personal attention of the senior officers, the ones whose files were marked in the internal language Eleanor had documented in her journal, with the notation maintained with discretion. Bernard Cole's file had carried that notation since 1966. Margaret closed her notebook on the fourth evening and sat in the library's reading room as the staff began making quiet closing announcements. Around her, the other patrons gathered their belongings. Students, retirees, people reading newspapers in the comfortable chairs near the windows. The ordinary population of a public library on a Thursday evening in Chicago. She thought about Bernard Cole, who had died in 2004 with an obituary that described him as a self-made man, a pioneer of Chicago commercial real estate, a philanthropist, a father. She thought about Daniel, who had inherited not just Bernard's business, but Bernard's method. The understanding that power in the world he moved through was something you built not through excellence, but through the strategic management of what other people knew and needed and feared. She thought about herself 12 years younger, sitting across a dinner table from Daniel Cole, and believing she understood what kind of man he was. Then she went back underground and stood in front of the east panel in the utility corridor. The combination Eleanor had left the founding year of the bank and the number of floors. 1928. 19 floors. The vault lock was a mechanical combination dial of the type common to commercial vaults manufactured between 1925 and 1945. Margaret had researched these as well. 3 number combinations entered with specific rotation sequences. She worked through the logical arrangements systematically. On her 7th attempt, 28-19-28, something shifted inside the mechanism. A deep, heavy click felt as much as heard traveling through the metal panel and into her hand. She pulled the panel open. The vault door was behind it, approximately 3 feet square set into the concrete wall, with a handle lever that turned smoothly, far more smoothly than it had any right to after 50 years, because the vault's interior environment had been dry and stable, protected from the freeze-thaw cycles that destroyed everything on the surface. Margaret opened it. Inside metal document boxes, 9 of them stacked in 3 rows. Each box was labeled in the precise, small handwriting she now recognized as Eleanor Marsh's. Date ranges, account series numbers, what appeared to be a filing system developed by someone who had been planning this for a long time. Margaret carried the boxes one at a time to the station manager's office. She arranged them on the desk and on the floor and sat down in her reading chair. Then she opened the first box and began to read. She read for 11 days. Not continuously, she slept, she ate, she maintained her routines at Archie's and the library to avoid any break in the patterns that might draw attention. But every available hour that she wasn't in the library researching context for what she was finding, she was in the station manager's office, working through Eleanor Marsh's archive. Eleanor had been extraordinarily thorough. The document boxes contained photocopies. Margaret marveled at the effort this must have represented in 1972, when photocopying required access to specific equipment of transaction records, internal memoranda, loan files, correspondence between Harrington Trust officers and their significant clients, and most valuably, a series of handwritten ledgers in which Eleanor had reconstructed the actual flow of money through the accounts she had access to, stripping away the constructed documentation to show the underlying reality. The picture that emerged was large and specific, and to Margaret's trained eye, extraordinarily well documented. Bernard Cole had moved money through Harrington Trust on a consistent basis from 1966 through 1972. The total, as best as Eleanor's records allowed Margaret to reconstruct, was approximately $18 million over 6 years, a massive sum for the period, representing in current value something closer to $140 million. The money had arrived in the bank's accounts attached to loan transactions that were on their face legitimate real estate financing. The loans were repaid also on their face through a series of corporate entities that existed on paper but had no genuine business operations. The repayment mechanism was the key. Margaret recognized it immediately because she had seen similar structures in less sophisticated forms in her forensic accounting work years ago. The money didn't need to be generated by the shell corporations. It needed only to appear to be. The actual funds came from elsewhere, from the kickback schemes and municipal manipulation that her research suggested, and from sources Eleanor had documented but not fully identified. Noting in her ledgers that the ultimate origin of certain funds was deliberately obscured beyond her ability to trace. What mattered was that the money came out of Harrington Trust clean, attached to real estate transactions, documented as legitimate business income, and that real estate purchased with laundered funds, documented as legitimate investment, became the foundation of the Cole family's property portfolio. The portfolio that Daniel had inherited, that he had expanded, that he had defended in the divorce proceedings as legitimate business assets built through his own efforts over 30 years. The assets that Margaret had been told she had no claim to. She sat with this for a long time. Then she turned to the box Eleanor had labeled separately from the others, with a notation that simply read, "Related Parties Political." Inside were records of a different type. Not transaction documentation, but correspondence. Letters and memoranda involving Harrington Trust, and a set of external relationships that Eleanor had identified as relevant to the bank's operations. One name appeared with particular frequency: James Harlan Voss. In 1971, a 33-year-old attorney with a practice on LaSalle Street, specializing in corporate and municipal law. His correspondence with the bank's senior officers was voluminous, detailed, and when read with Eleanor's annotations, damning. Voss had served as the legal architect for a significant portion of the transaction structures Eleanor had documented. He had written the opinions that gave the loan structures their appearance of legitimacy. He had Eleanor noted in a memo she had written to herself and included in the box almost certainly known exactly what he was doing. James Harlan Voss was currently serving his fourth term as a United States Senator from the state of Illinois. He had announced 8 weeks ago his intention to seek the governorship of Illinois in the coming election cycle. His campaign had been endorsed by the Chicago Tribune and 3 of the state's largest business associations. He was considered the front-runner. Margaret sat in the station manager's office and looked at the wall for a very long time. Then she wrote 2 words in her notebook, 11 weeks. That was how long remained until the primary election. 11 weeks in which Voss was still a candidate rather than a governor-elect. 11 weeks in which the exposure of his role in the Harrington Trust transactions would destroy a political campaign rather than force a recall. The timing mattered because timing was everything. Margaret understood this not as philosophy, but as arithmetic. Information released too early gives the target time to construct a response. Released too late, the damage is limited by the irreversibility of the outcome. Released at the precise right moment with the right recipients receiving it simultaneously, the impact is total and the response capability is nil. She had 11 weeks. She needed to use them correctly. It was in this period of intensive document review that Garrett Wills found her. She heard him before she saw him. Footsteps in the utility corridor, unhurried, professional, accompanied by the specific sounds of someone conducting a routine inspection rather than searching for anything. The scrape of a clipboard against a wall. The click of a flashlight being switched on. Margaret was in the station manager's office when she heard the sounds, and she moved immediately and without panic to the back corner of the room, positioning herself behind the open door. The footsteps passed. The office door continued down the platform, returned, slowed, stopped. A flashlight beam moved through the doorway. "Hello," a male voice, cautious but not threatening. "I can see there's someone here. I'm not police. I'm Transit Authority Maintenance." Margaret stepped out from behind the door. The man with the flashlight was approximately 40 years old, broad-shouldered, in a Transit Authority uniform with a name tag she couldn't read in the cross-illumination of their 2 lights. He was looking at the station manager's office, the cot, the reading chair, the LED lighting the organized supplies with an expression of complete and genuine astonishment. He looked at Margaret. He looked at Shadow, who had materialized on the desk and was regarding him with the detached assessment cats apply to new humans. He looked around the office again. "How long have you been down here?" he said. 6 weeks, Margaret said. 6 weeks. He absorbed this. "In Harrington Station?" "Yes." He walked out onto the platform without saying anything further. Margaret followed, watching him move through the space she had spent 6 weeks restoring: the cleaned mosaic walls, the polished brass fixtures, the reading nook she had created in the alcove near the north end, the books arranged on the salvaged shelving. He walked slowly, the flashlight moving, and she could see him processing what he was seeing. He stopped at the far end of the platform and turned around. "My name is Garrett Wills," he said. "I've been doing maintenance inspection on the abandoned stations for 8 years. He paused. "This is the most extraordinary thing I've ever seen in a decommissioned station. My name is Margaret Cole. You did all of this?" "Yes." He looked at the mosaic wall nearest to him, the green and gold border pattern gleaming in the flashlight beam. He reached out and touched the tile carefully, as if confirming it was real. "I should report this," he said. "I know. Technically, you're trespassing on transit authority property, and you've made alterations to a decommissioned structure. I'm aware." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father worked in this neighborhood. LaSalle Street, 1970s, early 1980s. He was a bookkeeper for a commercial real estate firm." He paused. "He used to talk about Harrington Trust, about the bank that was in the building above this station. He said there was a woman who worked there who tried to tell people something was wrong with the bank's accounts. He said nobody listened to her, and then she was just gone." Margaret was very still. "Eleanor Marsh," she said. Garrett Wills looked at her. "You know about Eleanor Marsh." "I found her journal," Margaret said. "In the inner office. She left it in 1972. The silence that followed this was different from the previous silences, heavier and more particular. "My father believed her," Garrett said quietly. "He always said she was telling the truth, and nobody wanted to hear it because the truth was inconvenient for people with money. He used to say that was the specific way Chicago worked. Not that the truth got suppressed, but that it got ignored until it stopped mattering." He looked at Margaret with an expression that had moved past professional assessment into something more personal. "I'm going to file my inspection report," he said. "It's going to say that Harrington Station is structurally sound, shows no evidence of water infiltration or active deterioration, and requires no immediate action." He held her gaze. "It's not going to say anything else." "Why?" Margaret asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. "Because Eleanor Marsh tried to do the right thing, and it cost her everything, and the people she was trying to stop went on living their lives without consequences." He looked around the platform once more. "And because whatever you're doing down here, I don't think it's finished yet." He pulled a card from his breast pocket and held it out. It was a standard transit authority maintenance card with his name and an internal phone number. "If anyone else from transit comes through, which they won't for at least 2 years, based on the inspection schedule, call me first. I'll come down with them." He paused. "And if you need anything related to the tunnels or the station's physical structure, I can help with that too. There are things about this station's layout I know that aren't in any public document." "Such as?" Margaret said. He crossed to the south wall of the platform and pointed to a section of tile that looked identical to every other section. "There's an access corridor behind this wall. It was built as an emergency exit during the station's original construction. It connects through the tunnel system to a service entrance on Federal Street, about 2 blocks south. He looked at her. If you ever needed to leave this station without going up through the main grating, that's how you'd do it. Margaret filed this information with the same careful attention she gave to everything. Thank you, Garrett, she said. Don't thank me, he said. Just finish whatever you're doing. After he left, Margaret stood on the platform for a long time. Then she went back to the document boxes and the work. She had known intellectually that what she was building toward was significant, but Garrett's presence, the confirmation that Eleanor Marsh's story had rippled outward in ways Eleanor never knew, that Garrett's father had carried her name for 50 years in a neighborhood that had long forgotten the bank she worked in, made it something more than a personal legal matter. Eleanor Marsh had tried to do the right thing and had been made to disappear. The people she had documented had gone on to build empires and political careers. Their children had inherited those empires and those careers. And the money, the original money dirty at its source, cleaned through a bank that no longer existed, ran through every asset in Daniel Cole's portfolio and every political relationship that Harlan Voss had cultivated over 4 decades. Margaret was not simply trying to recover what her marriage had cost her. She was trying to finish what Eleanor had started. This clarification of purpose focused her considerably. She spent the following 2 weeks completing her document review and beginning the construction of what she thought of as the case file, a structured, cross-referenced presentation of the evidence Eleanor had preserved, organized not as raw historical documents, but as a coherent narrative of financial crime suitable for the specific recipients she intended to send it to. Each recipient would receive a version tailored to their jurisdiction and interest. The IRS would receive the tax fraud analysis. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit would receive the money laundering documentation. The Illinois Attorney General would receive the state-level fraud and corruption material. The Chicago Tribune's investigative desk would receive a version designed to be immediately comprehensible to a journalist with the supporting documentation appended. She was in the middle of this work, sitting in the station manager's office at 11 in the evening, surrounded by organized document stacks, when she heard something from above. Not from the platform, not from the utility corridor, from above. Footsteps on the grating. She was on her feet before she had consciously processed the sound, moving to the light strip and pressing the switch, dropping the office into darkness. Shadow, who had been sleeping on the corner of the desk, went instantly and completely still in the way cats do when the human in the room signals alarm, that absolute held breath, stillness, that is one of the most ancient animal responses to perceived threat. The footsteps on the grating were deliberate, not a pedestrian walking across without noticing it. Someone standing on it, moving on it back and forth, as if testing it or examining it. Margaret stood in the complete darkness of the station manager's office, with her back against the wall, breathing slowly, listening. A voice from above, muffled by 36 steps of concrete and the weight of the street, but audible in the profound quiet of the underground space. A man's voice. Daniel's voice. She could not make out all the words. The acoustics of the space carried some phrases and swallowed others, but the fragments she could hear were enough. Around here somewhere. Told me she's been in this area every day for 3 weeks. A pause. He was on the phone. I don't care how long it takes. She's got something. I don't know what she has, but she's got 12 years of being in that house, and she's not stupid, whatever I said in court. Find her. Another pause. Just find her today. I need to know where she is. Margaret stood in the darkness with her back against the wall and did not move and did not breathe more than was strictly necessary. And above her head, on the grating that was the only entrance to this space, besides the Federal Street tunnel that Garrett Wills had shown her, Daniel Cole stood and spoke into his phone about finding her. He was afraid of her. She had known this intellectually, had recognized from his behavior in the courthouse that what he projected as contempt was built on something more anxious than contempt. But knowing it intellectually and standing 36 steps below him while he betrayed it to a private investigator over the phone were different orders of knowledge. He was afraid because he knew her. He had dismissed her in court, had allowed his attorneys to portray her as a woman of limited capability and no relevant skills. But he had lived with her for 12 years, and some part of him remembered who she actually was before he had spent those years systematically undermining it. He was afraid because the money, Bernard Cole's money, Harrington Trust money, 50 years of constructed legitimacy, was vulnerable in ways he probably didn't even fully understand. He didn't know about Eleanor's vault, but he knew Margaret was an accountant, and he knew she was angry, and he knew those two things in combination were dangerous. Above her head, the footsteps moved on the grating, back and forth. Slow, 4 minutes. Margaret counted them. Then the footsteps moved away and disappeared. She stood in the darkness for another 10 minutes before she turned the light back on. Shadow had not moved from her position on the desk. She looked at Margaret with the yellow-eyed attention of a creature assessing whether the threat had genuinely passed. He was right there, Margaret said quietly. Shadow blinked once. He has no idea. Margaret sat down at the desk. She looked at the organized document stacks, at the labeled boxes, at 40 pages of research notes and the case file she was constructing, with the precision she had brought to every piece of financial analysis she had done in her professional life. She thought about Daniel standing on the grating, afraid of what she might have, while the full scope of what she actually had sat 36 steps beneath his feet. Then she picked up her pen and went back to work. She called Aldous Beckett the following morning from a prepaid phone she had purchased specifically for sensitive communications. He answered on the second ring. "Mr. Beckett," she said, "my name is Margaret Cole. I sent you an email approximately 6 weeks ago regarding fraud in a divorce proceeding." "I remember," he said. His voice was measured, attentive, the voice of someone who listened carefully before speaking. "I need to meet with you," she said, "in person. I have documentation of something considerably larger than what I described in the email. A brief pause. How much larger? It involves a current United States Senator, Margaret said, and financial crimes spanning 50 years, and I have the original documents. The pause this time was longer. When can you meet? Beckett said. They met 2 days later at the Harold Washington Library in one of the private study rooms that could be reserved for 2 hours. Margaret brought a selection of the copied documents, not the originals, which remained in the vault, and spent 90 minutes walking Aldous Beckett through what she had found. Beckett was 61 years old, angular, with a quality of focused attention that Margaret recognized and trusted. He did not interrupt. He did not express theatrical astonishment. He read what she put in front of him, asked precise questions, and took notes in a small leather notebook with a fountain pen. When she finished, he sat back and looked at the table for a long moment. The original documents, he said. Where are they? Secure, she said. I'll need to verify them. You will. I'll arrange access when I'm ready. He looked at her steadily. The senator has 9 weeks until the primary. 8.5, Margaret said. I'm aware. The timing is critical. I know exactly what the timing needs to be. I need to know from you what the legal process requires in terms of how the materials are presented to the relevant authorities and in what sequence. Beckett nodded slowly, and the meeting became, for the next 40 minutes, a working session between two professionals who understood what they were building and what it needed to look like. When she left the library, Margaret walked back toward the financial district through a city that was going about its ordinary business under a November sky pale and high and cold. She walked past the Harrington Trust building without looking up at the carved figures over the entrance. She had stopped needing to look at them. She knew what they said. Commerce, industry, justice. In that order, Eleanor Marsh's world had placed them. Commerce first, justice last, if at all. Margaret had a different preference for the sequence. She descended through the grating down 36 steps and back into the station that had been her home for nearly 2 months. Shadow was waiting on the platform, which was unusual. The cat typically preferred the warmth of the inner office. She sat at the edge of the platform looking toward the tunnel with the specific alert attention that meant she had heard something. Margaret listened. The ordinary rumble of the city, the distant train, the building settling, and then very faint but present a sound from the Federal Street tunnel. The secondary access Garrett Wills had shown her. A distant, hollow echo of something that might have been a door closing somewhere deep in the tunnel system. She and Shadow both stood still for 30 seconds. The sound didn't repeat. Margaret looked at the tunnel entrance for a long moment, then looked at Shadow. Noted, she said quietly. She went into the office, sat at the desk, and opened her notebook to the page where she had written 11 weeks. She crossed it out and wrote beneath it 8.5. Then she picked up her pen and continued building the case that was going to take everything Daniel Cole and Harlan Voss had spent 50 years constructing and reduce it with the precision of a forensic accountant who had nothing left to lose and everything to prove to exactly what it had always been. Evidence. She sent the first package on a Monday, not because Monday carried any particular significance, but because she had been ready since the previous Thursday and had made herself wait through the weekend. Patience was not a virtue Margaret Cole had been born with. It was one she had constructed deliberately over 12 years of living with a man who used impulsiveness as a weapon against anyone who displayed it. She had learned to wait the way a surgeon learns to be still, not from temperament, but from the understanding that the cost of moving too soon was higher than the cost of waiting. The packages were not sent from anywhere near the financial district. Margaret had taken the Blue Line to Logan Square on Sunday evening, stayed at a budget motel under a name that matched the prepaid credit card she had opened 3 months earlier, and spent Monday morning at a shipping center on Milwaukee Avenue, preparing and sending 4 separate packages to 4 separate recipients. Each package was a version of the same core material tailored to its recipient. The Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division, received a 47-page document presenting the tax fraud analysis Margaret had constructed from Eleanor's records. The movement of money through Harrington Trust, the beneficial recipients, the specific tax years affected, and the connection to Daniel Cole's current assets. The document was organized as a forensic accounting report because that was what it was formatted to the standards she had learned 25 years earlier and had not forgotten. Attached to it were copies of the most critical underlying documents from Eleanor's archive: the transaction records, the internal memoranda, the ledger reconstructions organized by exhibit number and cross-referenced to the main analysis. Covering letter. The attached materials document a pattern of tax fraud involving money laundering through the Harrington Trust Bank of Chicago between 1966 and 1972, with direct benefit flowing to entities currently controlled by Daniel B. Cole of Chicago, Illinois. The original source documents are preserved and available for examination upon request. A concerned citizen. The FBI Financial Crimes Unit received a version focused on the money laundering mechanics, the shell corporations, the loan structures, the movement of funds across state lines, and in several documented instances internationally. This version was longer, more technical, built around the specific statutory language of federal money laundering statutes. Margaret had spent 3 days in the library reading case law to make sure she understood what the FBI would need to see and in what form they would need to see it. The Illinois Attorney General's office received a version centered on the state-level dimensions, the corruption of state-regulated financial institutions, the involvement of a then-licensed Illinois attorney in facilitating illegal transactions, and the specific identity of that attorney, James Harlan Voss, currently serving as United States Senator and candidate for Governor of Illinois. This version was the most carefully constructed of the 4. Margaret had gone through it 7 times, checking every claim against the underlying documentation, making sure that every assertion she made about Voss was supported by specific records in Eleanor's archive. She was not making allegations. She was presenting documented evidence of what a licensed attorney had done in 1971 and 1972, supported by the original documents from the transactions he had structured. She let the documents speak. Her text was minimal, precise, and deliberately free of language that could be characterized as interpretive or argumentative. The fourth package went to a specific person at the Chicago Tribune. His name was Owen Calloway. Margaret had identified him through 6 weeks of reading the Tribune's investigative coverage, not current coverage, but the archive going back 15 years. Calloway was 63, had been at the paper for 31 years, and had broken 3 major financial corruption stories in that time. His work had a specific quality that Margaret recognized and valued. He followed the money. Not the personalities, not the political drama, but the actual movement of actual funds through actual institutions. He understood financial documentation, and he understood how to explain it to readers who didn't. His package contained a version of the materials designed for a journalist less technical than the regulatory submissions, more narrative with a clear timeline and a clear account of Eleanor Marsh's role in preserving the evidence. Margaret had written a 3-page introduction that told Eleanor's story directly. Who she had been, what she had seen, what she had done with what she saw, and what had happened to her, or rather, what had not happened, because Eleanor Marsh had simply disappeared from the record in early 1973, and Margaret had found no evidence of what became of her. She wrote that section carefully. Eleanor deserved to be written about carefully. At the bottom of the introduction, she wrote, "The original documents described in this summary are preserved and authenticated. They have been submitted simultaneously to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, the FBI Financial Crimes Unit, and the Illinois Attorney General's Office." This is not a tip. This is a notification that a story already exists and is already in motion. She sealed the packages. She paid for express delivery. She walked back to the blue line and rode it east and then south, and then walked the last 6 blocks to the financial district and descended through the grating into Harrington Station. Shadow was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, which she almost never was. The cat looked at Margaret with the specific attention that could mean many things, and Margaret set down her bag and crouched down and stroked her. "It's done," she said. Shadow turned and walked back toward the platform, and Margaret followed. She had calculated the sequence carefully with Aldous Beckett. The regulatory agencies would move at their own pace. The IRS and FBI could be expected to begin preliminary review within 2 to 3 weeks, with any formal investigation taking considerably longer. The Attorney General's office, facing a political dimension involving a sitting senator and gubernatorial candidate, would move more carefully, but potentially more quickly, once the political implications registered. Owen Calloway at the Tribune was the variable she was least certain about. Investigative journalists operated on their own timelines and their own judgments about when a story was ready. She had given him enough to understand what existed. Whether he would pursue it and how quickly was outside her control. What was not outside her control was the legal dimension of her own situation. She called Aldous Beckett that evening. "They've been sent," she said. All four, Monday morning." A pause. "Then we filed to reopen the divorce proceedings on Wednesday." "Wednesday," she agreed. The motion to reopen was based on two grounds. The first was the wire transfer evidence Margaret had found the $40,000 from Daniel to her former attorney, which constituted corruption of the legal process and rendered the settlement voidable. The second was the newly identified evidence of fraudulent financial disclosure during the divorce proceedings, specifically Daniel's failure to disclose the full nature and origin of the Cole family assets. Beckett had been building the motion for 6 weeks. Margaret had read it twice, a precise and thorough document. It laid out the timeline of the original proceedings, the specific representations made by Daniel's legal team about his assets, and the evidence that those representations had been materially false. It cited the relevant Illinois case law on fraudulent disclosure in divorce proceedings and the remedies available. The motion was filed on Wednesday morning in Cook County Circuit Court. By Thursday afternoon, Daniel Cole's lead attorney had received notice. Margaret was in the library when Beckett called her on the prepaid phone. "His attorney called me 40 minutes after the notice arrived," Beckett said. His voice was professionally composed, but she could hear something beneath it, the contained satisfaction of a litigator who had delivered something unexpected to an opponent who had not expected to need defenses. He wanted to know the basis for the motion. "What did you tell him?" "I told him to read it. It's all in the motion." A brief pause. "He said his client maintains the original settlement was properly negotiated and that any new claims are without merit." "Of course he did." "He also asked specifically where you are. He said Daniel Cole has been attempting to reach you." "I'm sure he has." "Margaret." Beckett's tone shifted slightly. "Is there something happening on a parallel track that I should know about?" "Yes," she said. "But you'll know it when it becomes public. It's better that way." Another pause. She could hear him processing this. Aldous Beckett was not a man who liked operating with incomplete information, but he was a man who understood strategic necessity. "All right," he said. "The hearing on the motion to reopen is set for 3 weeks from Friday. Between now and then, I'd expect Daniel's team to make approaches." "What kind of approaches?" "Settlement offers. They'll want to resolve this quietly if they can. They'll offer you more money to go away." "I know," Margaret said. "What would you like me to tell them if they do?" Margaret looked around the library's reading room. The ordinary Thursday afternoon population, students, retired people, a woman at the next table feeding crackers quietly to a toddler in a stroller. "Tell them I'm not interested in going away," she said. She went back underground that evening and cooked rice on the camping stove and fed Shadow and sat in her reading chair on the platform with the Cheever stories and read for 2 hours and did not think about Daniel Cole or Harlan Voss or Eleanor Marsh or any of it. This was something she had learned over the past 2 months. The necessity of genuine rest, real mental disengagement. The ability to put something down completely for a few hours and let the deeper processing happen without conscious interference. She had not been good at this during her marriage. Daniel's world had been totalizing. There had always been something that needed her attention, some obligation or social demand or crisis that required her presence. She had forgotten for a very long time what it felt like to simply sit quietly and read a book because she wanted to. She remembered now. Shadow slept on the oak side table. The LED strips on the restored mosaic walls cast their warm light across green and gold tile. Somewhere above Chicago moved through its Thursday evening, and Margaret Cole read short stories in an underground palace that no one knew existed, and was in the specific and sufficient way of someone who has finally found the ground under their feet at peace. 14 days after the packages were sent, Owen Calloway called. He had found the prepaid number through a method she didn't ask about, and he didn't explain which told her something useful about him. "Ms. Cole," he said, "I've spent 2 weeks with the materials you sent me, and I need to ask you directly the source documents. You say they're authenticated. Have they been examined by anyone besides yourself?" "They will be," she said. "I've made them available to federal investigators. They're original documents from 1968 to 1972, in a condition consistent with that period of preservation. The chain of custody is documentable." "Where were they preserved?" "In a sealed vault, in a location I'd prefer not to identify yet." A pause. "Eleanor Marsh," he said. "I want to talk to you about her specifically." "She's in the introduction I wrote." "I know what you wrote. I've read it many times. I want to know what you found beyond the documents, the journal." "You mentioned a journal in the introduction." Margaret considered this. "The journal exists," she said. "It's Eleanor's account of what she saw and what she did. I can make it available to you as part of the broader story." "Is there any indication of what happened to her after 1973? "No," Margaret said. "She disappears from the record. I couldn't find her." Calloway was quiet for a moment. "I found her," he said. Margaret sat very still. Eleanor Marsh moved to Portland, Oregon in March of 1973, under her maiden name, which was Eleanor Fitch. She died there in 2009. She was a bookkeeper for a small nonprofit for 30 years. She never talked about Chicago or about Harrington Trust. She had a daughter. A pause. "The daughter is still alive." Margaret did not say anything for a moment. "Does the daughter know?" she said finally. "Not yet. I wanted to speak with you first." Another pause. "I'm going to run this story, Ms. Cole. The financial crimes, the Cole family connection, the senator's involvement. I have enough to run it right now with what you've given me and what my own reporting has confirmed. But I want to wait 2 more weeks if you're willing, because the IRS and FBI timelines suggest something is moving, and a story that runs simultaneously with federal action is considerably more impactful than one that runs ahead of it." 2 weeks takes us to 6 days before the primary, Margaret said. "Yes," Calloway said. It does. Run it when you're ready, she said. And when you talk to Eleanor's daughter, tell her that her mother's work mattered. Tell her it's the reason any of this is happening. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of the entire experience. Margaret had set everything in motion. The case file was with the federal authorities. The motion to reopen was filed. Beckett was managing the legal dimension. Calloway was managing the journalistic one. There was nothing left for Margaret to do except wait, and she was better at waiting now than she had been 2 months ago. She cooked. She cleaned. She continued the slow restoration work on the far end of the platform that she hadn't yet gotten to a section of tile near the tunnel mouth that was intact, but still coated in the original layer of decades-old grime. She read. She wrote in her own journal, which had become over the course of her time underground a document she valued in a way she hadn't anticipated. She thought about Eleanor Marsh in Portland, Oregon, a bookkeeper for a nonprofit. 30 years of quiet, useful, anonymous work. A daughter. Had Eleanor thought about the vault? Had she wondered in the last years of her life whether anyone had ever found it? Had she carried the weight of what she had tried to do and what had been done to silence her quietly for 36 years until she died? Margaret hoped she had found some peace. She suspected Eleanor had. Some people, the ones who have done what was right at great personal cost, arrive eventually at a particular kind of equanimity that is different from happiness, but more durable. Eleanor Marsh had hidden the weapon. She had written the instructions. She had trusted that eventually someone would come. Margaret thought about that trust. The specific vulnerability of it, leaving a key for a door you would never see opened for a person you would never meet. On the faith that the world was not so completely corrupted that justice was impossible. She was not a sentimental person, but she thought about Eleanor's trust every day for those 2 weeks. On the 15th day, everything moved at once. She was at Archie's at 7 in the morning, drinking coffee at the counter, when her phone showed a news alert from the Tribune. She opened it. The story was enormous. Owen Calloway had not simply written a corruption piece, he had written a history. 5,000 words that began with the founding of Harrington Trust in 1928 and moved through its growth, its corruption, its failure, and the 50-year afterlife of the money it had laundered, the money that had become the Cole family real estate portfolio, the money that had funded Bernard Cole's business and Daniel Cole's inheritance, and the political career of Harlan Voss, who had structured the transactions as a 33-year-old attorney and had spent 40 years hoping no one would find the paperwork. Eleanor Marsh's name was in the second paragraph. Her story was told in full, the journal, the vault, the documents she had preserved at personal risk, her disappearance from Chicago, and her quiet life in Portland. Her daughter, Rachel Fitch, was quoted. She had spoken to Calloway the previous afternoon. "My mother never talked about Chicago," Rachel Fitch had said. She said it was a part of her life she had closed. But she kept one thing, a copy of a single page from a ledger she had made in 1972. She kept it in an envelope in her desk for the rest of her life. When I asked her about it, she said, "It's evidence, in case someone ever needs it." I never understood what she meant until now. Margaret read that paragraph 3 times. Then she put the phone down on the counter and drank her coffee and looked at the diner's front window where the early morning light was coming through and turning the ordinary street outside something close to beautiful. By 10 o'clock, Daniel Cole's attorneys had issued a statement calling the Tribune story defamatory and the underlying documents fabricated. By noon, the FBI had confirmed to the Tribune that an investigation was ongoing and that it had no further comment. By 2 in the afternoon, Senator Harlan Voss had announced through his press secretary that he was suspending his gubernatorial campaign pending review of the allegations. Not withdrawing, suspending. The distinction was the last vanity of a man who couldn't yet accept that there was no pathway forward. By the following morning, it was withdrawal. The press conference was brief and carefully worded and convinced no one. Voss looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and had finally been required to put it down in public. Margaret watched the press conference on a library computer. She watched Voss's face throughout it, not his words, which were the careful compositions of crisis management professionals, but his face, which was the face of a 77-year-old man who had spent 44 years waiting for this morning and had never entirely stopped expecting it. She felt no satisfaction at his distress. What she felt was closer to the particular gravity that attends the completion of something that should have happened long ago. Not triumph, not relief. Simply the weight of late justice, which is heavier than timely justice, because it carries the additional mass of everything it was too late to undo. The federal asset freeze on Daniel Cole's accounts came 11 days after the Tribune story ran. Beckett called her within an hour of the announcement. "His accounts are frozen," he said. "Business and personal. He's going to have difficulty paying his legal team." A pause that contained what might have been professional satisfaction. "The hearing on the motion to reopen is in 4 days. His attorney has already contacted me with a settlement offer." "What did they offer?" $2 million and a non-disclosure agreement." "No," Margaret said. "I told him that. He said 3. "No." "Also no," Beckett agreed. "I told him we'd see them at the hearing." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Margaret sat at the plaintiff's table in the same courtroom where the divorce had been finalized. And this time she had Aldous Beckett beside her, instead of the man who had been paid to lose on her behalf. Daniel was not present. His attorney had advised against it correctly. But she could feel his absence as a kind of presence, the shape of someone who had calculated that he could ignore a problem until it went away and had now discovered the calculation's terminal flaw. Judge Beaumont, who had finalized the divorce 11 weeks earlier, presided. He looked at the motion and the supporting documentation for a long time before he looked at the room. "The court finds that the evidence presented establishes sufficient basis to vacate the original settlement on grounds of fraudulent financial disclosure and corruption of the legal process," he said. "The matter is remanded for full financial disclosure proceedings and new settlement determination." He looked at Margaret over his reading glasses with an expression she couldn't entirely read. "Mrs. Cole," he said, "I want it on the record that this court takes the corruption of legal proceedings with extraordinary seriousness. Whatever occurs in the federal investigations currently underway is separate from this court's concern. But within this court's jurisdiction, the process that led to the original settlement was compromised, and this court intends to correct that."
"Thank you, Your Honor," Margaret said. She meant it simply and directly, without drama. The next morning, the event she had been calculating for 6 weeks finally arrived. Martin Griggs called Aldous Beckett. Martin Griggs was the attorney who had represented Margaret in the original divorce proceedings. The attorney who had accepted $40,000 from Daniel Cole to ensure that his own client received the minimum possible settlement. He had been practicing law in Chicago for 22 years, and he had presumably understood when he cashed that wire transfer that the moment described by Beckett's call was always theoretically possible. Now it was actual. With the FBI investigation expanding and federal subpoenas beginning to move through Daniel Cole's professional network, Griggs had received that morning a call from a federal prosecutor's office requesting documentation related to his representation of Margaret Cole and his financial relationship with Daniel Cole during the divorce period. He called Beckett before he called his own attorney. The conversation, as Beckett relayed it to Margaret, was not long. Griggs wanted to know whether cooperation with the federal investigation and with the divorce reopening could be arranged in exchange for some form of consideration in whatever legal exposure he personally faced. Beckett had told him to make that arrangement with the federal prosecutors. What Beckett could offer subject to Margaret's agreement was a declaration that the divorce proceedings would not pursue separate civil action against Griggs personally, provided his cooperation was complete and his testimony was full and accurate. "He'll take it," Beckett said. "I know," Margaret said. She had known with a certainty that was not vindictiveness, but simply accurate assessment of human nature, that Griggs would choose self-preservation when the choice became unavoidable. Men like Martin Griggs did not make the calculations they made because they were unusually corrupt. They made them because, in the world, Daniel Cole, moved through the calculation, had always appeared to carry no meaningful risk. The $40,000 had looked like a clean transaction. Take the money, deliver the outcome, never speak of it. The risk had looked theoretical. Margaret had made the risk actual. She had done it not out of rage. The rage had been present in the first days after she understood what Griggs had done, and she had experienced it fully and then set it aside, because rage was not a useful tool for what she was building. She had done it out of the cold, specific conviction that what had been done to her deserved a complete accounting, and that a complete accounting required patience, documentation, and the willingness to construct something airtight before moving. She had learned to construct things from Eleanor Marsh, who had built her archive under fear and pressure, and had trusted it to whoever came after her. She had learned patience from 12 years of watching Daniel Cole operate, and understanding finally that the most dangerous thing she could become was not angry, but ready. The new settlement proceedings took 8 weeks. Margaret was present for all of it, seated beside Aldous Beckett, watching the full financial picture of the Cole family assets emerge into the legal record for the first time. Properties, investment accounts, business entities. The offshore structures that the IRS investigation had begun to unravel. The full valuation of what Bernard Cole's laundered money had built over 50 years of compounding investment and real estate appreciation. The final settlement was $9.8 million in cash and assets, plus title to the property that had been the marital home, the house on North Burling Street that Daniel's attorneys had argued in the original proceedings was solely his. Margaret sold it within 6 weeks of receiving title. She did not want to live in it. Daniel Cole was indicted on federal charges 4 months after the Tribune story ran. The charges included money laundering, tax fraud, wire fraud, and RICO-related conspiracy charges tied to his knowing receipt and use of assets derived from the original Harrington Trust scheme. His legal team was expensive and aggressive and delayed the proceedings for as long as procedural mechanisms allowed. He was ultimately convicted on the primary counts and sentenced to 11 years in a federal correctional facility. He sent a message through Beckett 6 months into his sentence, asking whether Margaret would be willing to speak with him. He wanted the message said to apologize. Margaret thought about this for 1 day. Then she sent back a single sentence through Beckett. "The apology isn't necessary. The sentence is sufficient." She meant it without cruelty. There was nothing Daniel could say to her that would add to or subtract from what had happened. The accounting was complete. The balance had been corrected. Whatever he was experiencing in a federal correctional facility was the consequence of choices he had made across decades, and her presence or absence from his emotional processing of those consequences changed nothing of substance. She had other things to do. The purchase of Harrington Station from the city of Chicago took 4 months of negotiation. The city was not accustomed to proposals for the purchase of decommissioned transit infrastructure, and the relevant municipal machinery moved with the deliberate pace of institutions that have never been asked to do something before. Margaret's proposal was thorough. She had spent 3 weeks writing it the architectural history of the station, the significance of its Art Deco design, the structural assessment Garrett Wills had provided in his transit authority capacity, the cultural case for adaptive reuse, and her specific vision for what the space would become. She included photographs, the restored mosaic walls, the polished brass fixtures, the full length of the platform under warm light. She also made clear through Beckett that she was aware of certain documentation regarding the history of the Harrington Trust building and its relationship to city municipal contracts in the 1960s and 1970s, and that she expected the purchase process to proceed with appropriate expedition. The city was happy to sell. The purchase price was $1.6 million. Margaret wrote the check an act that still felt slightly surreal and took possession of Harrington Station legally on a cold March morning 17 months after she had first descended the 36 steps with a flashlight and a cat carrier and no plan. She stood on the platform for a long time after the paperwork was signed. Shadow sat beside her on the tile, looking down the length of the restored space, with the satisfied proprietorial air of a creature who had known all along that this was home.
The renovation took 8 months.
Margaret hired architects and contractors through a competitive process, presenting her vision in detail and selecting teams who demonstrated genuine understanding of what she was trying to do. Not restore the station to a simulacrum of its original function, but honor its architecture and history while giving it a new purpose that justified its existence to the city above it. Proper electrical systems designed to work with the station's original aesthetic. Plumbing, climate control calibrated to the underground environment. Accessibility modifications, elevator access from the building above which Margaret had purchased as part of the development. Safety systems, professional restoration of the mosaic tile throughout the platform, done by craftspeople who worked section by section with the same patient attention Margaret had brought to the original cleaning. The station manager's office. Her first room, the room where she had slept on her coat that first night with Shadow against her side. She kept exactly as it was, clean but unchanged. The simple desk, the wooden chair, the brass fixture on the ceiling, a small plaque beside the door that read, Margaret Cole, resident, October to December. Below it, a second plaque, Eleanor Marsh, Accountant, Harrington Trust, 1961 to 1973. She tried to tell the truth. She left the tools for whoever came next. The Harrington Arts and Culture Station opened on a Saturday in November, 22 months after the divorce was finalized. The opening night event was a concert, a string quartet playing Beethoven on the restored platform. The audience seated in the space that had once been a commuter platform and was now something that had no exact prior precedent. 300 people attended. Architecture critics came and wrote about the space in terms that made Margaret's design choices feel both validated and slightly outside herself, as if they were describing something someone else had built. She stood at the back of the platform during the concert and listened. The sound in the space was extraordinary. The arched tile ceiling and walls created an acoustic environment that the quartet's violinist told her afterward was unlike anything he had played in. The music moved through the underground space and reflected off surfaces that had been waiting 80 years for exactly this use. Shadow was there because Shadow went where Margaret went, and the Transit Authority's formal use permit for Harrington Station contained a specific provision Margaret had insisted on it acknowledging the resident cat's prior claim on the property. Garrett Wills was in the third row. Beside him sat his father, 81 years old, in a good suit, with the careful movements of a man who has learned to be deliberate with his body. Garrett had told Margaret his father had worked in this neighborhood 50 years ago, had known Eleanor Marsh's name, had carried it. At intermission, she went to where they were sitting. The elder Mr. Wills looked up at her and then looked around the platform. The mosaic walls, the brass fixtures glowing warmly. The audience of 300 people in what had been an abandoned space for 60 years. "I never thought I'd see this place," he said. His voice was the voice of a very old man at the end of a long life who has been presented with something that exceeded his expectations of what was possible. "I used to walk past that building
up there when I was a young man. I knew this was down here. I never thought anyone would care enough to do this."
"Eleanor Marsh cared," Margaret said. He nodded. He looked at the south wall, the section of mosaic that Margaret had designated with a small engraved marker at eye level as the Eleanor Marsh Memorial Wall. "She would have loved this," he said quietly. Margaret did not say anything. She nodded once and went back to her place at the rear of the platform.
The quartet resumed. Beethoven moved through the underground space, through the Art Deco arches, and across the green and gold tile through the light of brass fixtures that had been dark for 70 years and were now simply finally on. Margaret stood and listened until the last note dissolved into the specific silence of an underground space in a large city, not empty. Silence, but inhabited silence. The silence of a place that has been returned to use and is now part of the life of the world above it.
18 months after the opening, Margaret published an essay in a national magazine. She had been approached by several publications and had declined all of them until this one, because this one agreed to her conditions. The essay would not be about her. It would be about Eleanor Marsh. She wrote it in the station manager's office, sitting at the simple desk with shadow on the corner in the room where she had first slept underground and first understood that being without everything was different from being without anything that mattered. She wrote about Eleanor Marsh honestly, who she had been, what she had seen, what she had done with it, and what it had cost her. She wrote about the vault and the journal and the specific bravery of a woman who had documented the truth and trusted it to the unknown future rather than letting it disappear with her. She wrote about Portland and 36 years of quiet, useful work, and a daughter who had kept a single page of a ledger in an envelope her entire adult life without fully knowing why. She wrote about what it means to do the right thing in a world that is not at the moment you do it, prepared to reward you for it. About the patience required to trust that the world can change, not in your lifetime, necessarily, not on your preferred schedule, but eventually, in the way that all accumulated truths eventually find their moment. The essay's final paragraph read, "Eleanor Marsh did not win in 1972. The people she tried to expose went on with their lives and their money and their carefully constructed legitimacy for 50 more years. But Eleanor left the tools and she trusted the future, and the future eventually, imperfectly 50 years late, came through. I don't know if that is enough. I don't know if it constitutes justice in any final sense. What I know is that Harrington Station is open, and the lights are on, and the space that Eleanor used to enter through a private staircase on her way to a job that was slowly revealing its own corruption is now full of music and people and the specific beauty of something rescued from being forgotten. I think Eleanor would have found that sufficient. I have decided to find it sufficient too." The essay was read by a great many people. Margaret received letters for months afterward from people who had worked in institutions that had asked them to look away from something wrong, from people who had tried to tell the truth
and found no one willing to listen from people who had been discarded by the systems and the people they had trusted and were trying to understand whether the ground beneath them was solid enough to build on again. She read every letter. She responded to as many as she could. She told them all the same thing in different words shaped to different circumstances. The ground is there. It is not always where you expect to find it, and it is not always immediately visible from where you are standing. But it is there. Sometimes you have to go underground to find it. Shadow lived to be 14 years old, which is a good age for a cat who spent her formative years in an abandoned subway station, developing sophisticated opinions about acoustics and tile quality and the precise height of surfaces suitable for observation. She was buried in the small garden of the building above Harrington Station in a corner that received morning light with a marker that read simply Shadow. She approved of all of it. Margaret continued as director of the Harrington Arts and Culture Station for many years. The space became what she had envisioned, a genuinely significant cultural institution, not in the way of large endowed museums, but in the way of places that develop an organic relationship with the communities that use them. Artists worked in the studio spaces. Musicians returned year after year because the acoustic environment was unlike anything else in the city. The gallery tunnel hosted work that was too unconventional for established venues and found in the underground space exactly the right context. The station's story, the real story, not the version in the architecture magazines, became known gradually in the way that true stories tend to become known. People who had been following the Cole prosecution read the Tribune's coverage and connected it to the cultural center. People who read Margaret's essay connected Eleanor Marsh to the memorial wall. People who visited the station found in the plaque beside the station manager's door the outline of something that deserved to be understood. Margaret never gave public talks about her time living underground. She answered questions about Eleanor Marsh at every opportunity. She answered questions about the vault and the documents and the 50-year patience of evidence waiting for someone with the capacity to use it. She answered questions about what it takes to build something from nothing and about the specific arithmetic of survival when survival is all you have to work with. She did not answer questions about Daniel Cole. There was nothing useful to say. He existed as a consequence, the natural terminus of a particular way of living in the world, the place you arrive when you have spent your life constructing a foundation on someone else's crime and calling it your own achievement. His story ended where it deserved to end. That was sufficient. What was not sufficient, and what Margaret continued to think about, in the way that some questions simply remain open regardless of how much time you give them, was Eleanor. Not what had happened to Eleanor. She knew that now in enough detail to have made her peace with it. Eleanor had survived. Eleanor had made a life. Eleanor had a daughter who knew her mother had tried. What Margaret continued to think about
was the specific quality of Eleanor's decision in 1972. The decision to go down into the closed station one more time with the documents she had copied at what must have been considerable personal risk, and put them in a vault, and lock them, and leave the combination in a journal. She had no guarantee anyone would ever find, and trust that it mattered. Eleanor had not known if it would matter. She had done it anyway.
Margaret sat in the station manager's office on the evenings when the station was quiet and the staff had gone home, and she thought about that decision, about the specific bravery of acting on behalf of a future you cannot see, trusting in the possibility of a justice you will never personally witness. She thought it was the most significant thing she had ever encountered. Not the vault itself, not the documents, not the 50 years of accumulated consequence. The decision to try, the decision to leave the tools, the decision to trust whoever came next. Outside, Chicago went about its business. Traffic and wind and the specific music of a large city moving through its night. 36 steps above Margaret's head, the Harrington Trust Building stood in the dark. Its limestone facade unchanged since 1928. The carved figures over the entrance presiding over a street that had forgotten them. Commerce, industry, justice. The lights inside the station were warm and steady. They had been on for years now, and Margaret Cole intended to keep them that way.